There is a question that almost no one asks, but that changes everything once it is finally faced. Why does being close to someone who says they love me make me feel anxious? Many people live in relationships where love is declared through words, but the body reacts as if it were in danger. The heart races, the mind cannot rest, the stomach tightens. And yet, the person insists on believing that this is normal, that it is part of love, that it is just personal insecurity or fear of loss. But it isn't. Anxiety around someone you love does not come out of nowhere. It is an emotional response to something that is not safe, predictable, or healthy. The problem is that culturally, we have been taught to romanticize suffering. We believe that loving means worrying too much, thinking too much, fearing too much. And little by little, we confuse anxiety with emotional depth. When you begin to feel constant anxiety around someone, it means you are always on emotional alert. You monitor tone of voice, messages, silences, mood changes. You feel that any mistake could cost you the relationship. And this turns love from a place of rest into an emotional minefield. The human body does not lie. Even before the rational mind realizes that something is wrong, the body reacts. It goes into alert mode when it senses instability, subtle rejection, inconsistent affection, or emotional manipulation. Anxiety, in this context, is not weakness. It is a form of self-protection. The real danger begins when the person ignores this signal. When they force themselves to stay, convince themselves they are overreacting, blame themselves for feeling too much. Gradually, they reshape themselves to fit into the relationship. They reduce their needs, silence their discomfort, adjust their personality to avoid conflict. And they call this love. But love should never require emotional self-betrayal in order to be accepted. This video is not about blaming anyone. It is about expanding awareness. It is about understanding that anxiety around someone you love is not a small thing, not something to ignore, and most of all, not something that should be normalized. Because when love hurts in silence, it leaves deep marks. And it all begins with that first discomfort that almost everyone tries to deny. Before any conscious thought, before any rational explanation, there is something that reacts first: the body. It perceives what the mind still tries to deny. That is why, when we talk about anxiety around someone you love, it is essential to understand that this is not an emotional flaw or a psychological weakness. It is an alarm. The human body was designed to detect threats. Not all threats are physical. Some are emotional, relational, and silent. When you connect with someone who is unpredictable, who alternates between affection and distance, who is warm one day and cold the next, the body enters a state of alert. It doesn't know when the next emotional shock will come, so it stays prepared at all times. That is why anxiety appears even in moments that seem calm. You may be sitting next to the person, laughing, talking, but inside, something never fully relaxes. There is a constant tension, as if you were waiting for something to go wrong. This state does not arise without reason. It is built through repeated experiences of instability. You may have felt this already. Your heart races when the tone of the conversation changes. Your stomach tightens when a reply takes too long. Your mind creates scenarios when silence appears. None of this happens because you are too sensitive. It happens because, on some level, you learned that the connection is not safe. The body learns patterns quickly. If loving someone involves tension, fear, rejection, or emotional punishment, the body records that as danger. The problem is that many people try to fix anxiety only through mental control. They try to convince themselves they are overreacting, that they need to trust more, that the problem is inside them. But relational anxiety cannot be healed only with positive thinking, because it was not created by thoughts. It was created by experiences. When someone has to walk on emotional eggshells to keep a relationship, the body never rests. It lives in survival mode. And living in survival for too long comes at a cost: emotional exhaustion, mental confusion, loss of self-worth, and disconnection from oneself. Ignoring the body's signals is one of the deepest forms of self-abandonment, because the body is trying to protect you from something that your mind may not yet be ready to accept. Understanding this changes everything. Anxiety stops being the enemy and becomes a message. And every message must be listened to before it turns into chronic pain. There is a silent point in many relationships where love stops being a shelter and becomes tension. This point does not arise from a single traumatic event, but from the accumulation of small experiences that gradually teach the body not to relax. At first, almost no one notices. The person only feels that something has changed. Conversations that once flowed now require caution. Words that were once natural begin to be measured. Simple gestures start to create doubt. Little by little, the bond stops being spontaneous and begins to demand emotional vigilance. When love becomes tension, you start living according to the other person's reactions. You pay too much attention to their mood, their energy, the way they respond. If they seem distant, you blame yourself. If they are cold, you try to compensate. If they show affection, you feel relief, but not safety. Because deep down, you know it can change at any moment. This cycle creates a constant state of anxiety. Love stops being a space of exchange and turns into a permanent test. You feel that you need to prove your value, your presence, your worthiness to stay. And the more you try to secure the bond, the more tense it becomes. The problem is that healthy relationships do not require this level of emotional effort to exist. They do not make you feel at risk all the time. They do not place your emotional stability in the hands of someone else's mood. When that happens, something essential has been broken: the sense of safety. Emotional safety does not mean the absence of conflict. It means knowing that even in difficult moments, you will not be discarded, ignored, or emotionally punished. When this safety is missing, the body enters defense mode. And anxiety is one of the main ways this defense manifests. Many people stay in this type of relationship because they confuse intensity with depth. Tension is interpreted as passion. Fear of loss is mistaken for true love. But love that requires constant vigilance demands a very high price. You slowly move away from who you truly are. You stop saying what you feel. You stop asking for what you need. You stop being spontaneous. And when you have to shrink yourself to keep someone close, love has already stopped being love a long time ago. Recognizing that love has turned into tension is not failure. It is clarity. It is the first step toward understanding that perhaps the problem is not loving too much, but staying in a bond where loving hurts. There is a type of anxiety that does not come only from the fear of losing the other person, but from a deeper and quieter fear, the fear of losing yourself within the relationship. This anxiety is difficult to identify because it disguises itself as care, dedication, intense love. But in truth, it arises when you begin to abandon yourself in order to keep someone close. When you feel constant anxiety around someone you love, it often means that, even unconsciously, you have already noticed that you are leaving important parts of yourself behind. You start adapting too much, shaping yourself too much, giving in too much. And each small concession creates an internal conflict that the body feels, even when the mind tries to justify it. You think twice before expressing an opinion. You swallow discomfort to avoid arguments. You minimize your feelings to avoid being seen as difficult. Little by little, you drift away from your own truth. This distancing generates anxiety because the body understands that something essential is under threat: your emotional identity. Human beings need internal coherence to feel safe. When you act differently from how you feel, when you silence what matters to preserve a bond, an internal fracture is created. And this fracture does not go unnoticed. It manifests as anxiety, confusion, irritability, and a kind of exhaustion that is not physical, but existential. Many people believe this discomfort is a normal price of love. That loving requires constant sacrifice, continuous renunciation, limitless adaptation. But there is a huge difference between compromising at times and continuously erasing yourself. Healthy love does not demand that you disappear in order to survive. Anxiety grows when you feel that to be loved, you must be less yourself. When you realize that certain parts of your personality are not welcome. When you understand that your spontaneity makes the other uncomfortable. In this scenario, the body goes into alert mode because it knows you are moving away from what keeps you whole. The fear of losing the relationship often turns out to be the fear of facing the emptiness that has formed inside you. And this creates a powerful emotional prison. You stay not because you are happy, but because you no longer know who you would be without that relationship. Recognizing this process is painful but liberating. Because anxiety stops being a mystery and becomes a clear signal, something in you is asking to be respected again. One of the greatest generators of anxiety in romantic relationships is inconsistent affection. It does not appear as clear aggression or direct rejection. On the contrary, it confuses. At times, the person shows care, presence, and interest. At other times, they pull away, become cold, go silent, or change their behavior without explanation. This back and forth creates an unstable emotional ground where anxiety thrives. The human brain seeks patterns to feel safe. When affection is predictable, the body relaxes. When it is unpredictable, the body goes into alert mode. Inconsistent affection teaches you to never feel completely safe because there is no guarantee of emotional continuity. You never know if today's warmth will exist tomorrow. This kind of dynamic makes you hypervigilant. You start analyzing small details: response time, tone of voice, message frequency, mood changes. And the more you try to understand what is happening, the more anxious you become, because there is no clear logic. The problem is not you, but the instability of the bond. Still, most people internalize the blame. They begin to think they need to try harder, be better, be more understanding, more patient, more available. This constant attempt to earn affection creates emotional dependence. Affection becomes a reward. Attention becomes a prize. Silence becomes punishment. In this scenario, love stops being an exchange and becomes an exhausting emotional game. Anxiety arises because the body cannot predict the emotional environment. It prepares for the worst, even during good moments. That is why, even when the relationship seems fine, you cannot fully relax. There is always a feeling that something could collapse at any moment. The most dangerous aspect of inconsistent affection is that it creates attachment through scarcity. You value the good moments even more precisely because they are not consistent. And this strengthens the bond not through safety, but through fear of losing what little you receive. Over time, this dynamic deeply erodes self-esteem. You begin to doubt your worth, your perception, your sensitivity. Anxiety becomes chronic because the emotional environment never stabilizes. Understanding the impact of inconsistent affection is essential to stop blaming yourself, because no one flourishes in unstable ground, and no healthy love is built on constant uncertainty. One of the most dangerous aspects of anxiety within romantic relationships is the moment when it stops being recognized as a signal and starts being treated as something normal. Anxiety no longer appears only during moments of conflict or clear instability. It becomes part of the emotional routine. It is present even on ordinary days, even when nothing is wrong. At this stage, the person no longer asks why they feel this way. They simply live with the tight chest, the racing mind, the constant sense of alert. The body no longer relaxes because it has learned that the emotional environment is not trustworthy. And when that happens, anxiety stops being episodic and becomes structural. Many people describe this state as permanent exhaustion, a kind of fatigue that does not improve with physical rest. Because the exhaustion does not come from the body, but from the constant need to emotionally adjust, to think before speaking, to measure reactions, to anticipate conflicts, to avoid displeasing. When anxiety becomes routine, the relationship starts consuming more energy than it gives. Even so, the person stays, believing that this wear and tear is an inevitable part of love. They normalize the discomfort because they do not know another way of relating. Perhaps because they learned early on that loving means suffering a little. Or perhaps because the fear of being alone feels greater than the fear of remaining anxious. At this point, anxiety begins to affect other areas of life. Concentration decreases. Sleep worsens. Self-esteem weakens. The person starts doubting their ability to have healthy relationships, and often begins to believe that the problem is them. The saddest part is that the longer someone stays in a relationship that generates constant anxiety, the harder it becomes to identify what is wrong. The body adapts to the state of alert. Suffering becomes the norm. And anything outside of that, even calm affection, starts to feel unfamiliar. Breaking this cycle requires awareness. It requires recognizing that chronic anxiety in a relationship is not a small thing. It is a sign that something fundamental is misaligned. Love should expand your life, not shrink it. It should bring emotional rest, not constant tension. When anxiety becomes routine, it stops protecting and starts harming. And this is a critical point. Either you listen to what it is trying to say, or you continue paying a silent and increasingly high price. One of the clearest signs that something is wrong in a relationship is the loss of inner peace. Not the idealized peace of constant happiness, but the basic sense of emotional balance. When being with someone leaves you more agitated than calm, more tense than comfortable, more worried than secure, that deserves attention. Inner peace does not come from the absence of problems, but from the presence of emotional safety. When you know you can be yourself, make mistakes, express feelings, and still be respected, the body relaxes. When this is missing, the body reacts. And the most common reaction is anxiety. The loss of peace does not happen abruptly. It creeps in slowly. First, you notice that you think too much about the relationship. Then, you start having difficulty relaxing even when you are away from the person. Next, thoughts become repetitive, revolving around conversations, behaviors, and possible interpretations. The mind does not rest because it tries to compensate for a lack of safety that should naturally come from the bond. Many people confuse this state of agitation with intense love. They believe that thinking too much is a sign of deep involvement. But overthinking is often a symptom that something is unclear, unsafe, or not being communicated in a healthy way. When you love someone and feel at peace, the relationship adds to your life. It does not occupy all your thoughts. It does not hijack your emotional energy. It walks alongside your life, not in place of it. But when a relationship consumes your peace, it starts to dominate your inner world. Anxiety grows because the emotional system becomes unbalanced. You cannot anchor yourself within because the bond demands constant attention. Any change, any silence, any sign of distance activates fear. And living like this is extremely exhausting. Losing inner peace is not a sign that you love too much. It is a sign that something in the relationship is disconnecting you from yourself. And that should not be ignored. Love that is worth it does not steal your basic tranquility. It may challenge you and encourage growth, but it does not destroy your emotional center. When peace disappears, it leaves behind a trail of anxiety. And that trail exists to warn you, not to be ignored. There is a direct relationship between anxiety in romantic bonds and fragile emotional boundaries. When boundaries are unclear or not respected, the body reacts. And one of the most common reactions is anxiety. This happens because without boundaries, a person loses the sense of control over themselves and over the emotional space they occupy in the relationship. Emotional boundaries are not walls. They are internal lines that define what is acceptable, what hurts, what invades, what respects your integrity. When these boundaries are repeatedly crossed, even in subtle ways, the body goes into alert mode. It understands that something is threatening its balance. In many relationships, anxiety arises because the person feels they must always be available, always understanding, always giving in. There is no space to say no without guilt. No space to ask for distance without fear. No space to disagree without emotional risk. This type of dynamic slowly erodes internal security. When you cannot set boundaries without negative emotional consequences, such as silence, coldness, emotional punishment, or withdrawal, your emotional system learns that protecting yourself comes at a high cost. So you begin to adapt, to avoid confrontation, to swallow discomfort, to stay quiet. Anxiety is born exactly there, in the conflict between what you feel and what you allow yourself to express. The absence of clear boundaries also creates emotional confusion. You don't know where the other ends and where you begin. Emotions mix. Responsibilities blur. You start carrying feelings that are not yours, problems that are not yours, guilt that should not exist. And the body responds with constant tension. Many people were taught that setting boundaries is selfish. That asking for space is a sign of coldness. That disagreeing is a sign of lack of love. These beliefs lead them to emotionally erase themselves to keep relationships. But the cost is high, loss of inner security and a progressive increase in anxiety. Healthy relationships respect boundaries. They do not punish individuality. They do not demand emotional fusion. They do not make you feel guilty for existing as a whole person. Where there is respect, there is space to breathe. Where there is space, the body relaxes. If your anxiety increases as you try to please, adapt, and mold yourself, maybe the problem is not you. Maybe it is the absence of respected boundaries. And your body is trying to show you that. There comes a crucial moment when anxiety stops being just discomfort and becomes an internal request for truth. Not truth in the sense of accusations or confrontation, but emotional truth. Truth with yourself. Truth about what is being felt, lived, and tolerated within the relationship. Anxiety begins to grow when there is a large gap between what you feel and what you allow yourself to acknowledge. When you know something is wrong, but continue pretending it isn't. When your intuition sends clear signals, but you silence them to keep the relationship going. This internal incongruence creates deep conflict, and the body responds with anxiety. Many people live in emotional denial for a long time. They know something hurts, something weighs heavy, something is off, but they're afraid to look directly at it. Afraid of losing. Afraid of being alone. Afraid of discovering that they invested time, energy, and affection into something that does not provide safety. Anxiety emerges exactly at this point of tension between inner truth and the reality they are trying to maintain. The body does not tolerate emotional lies for long. It begins to react. Insomnia, restlessness, obsessive thoughts, tightness in the chest. These symptoms are not random. They are attempts to draw attention to something that needs to be faced. In this context, anxiety is an invitation to honesty. It asks, are you being truthful with yourself? Are you respecting what you feel? Or are you emotionally betraying yourself to avoid facing a loss? Being truthful with yourself does not mean making impulsive decisions. It means, above all, stopping self-deception. Recognizing that love should not require constant internal silence. That a healthy bond allows difficult conversations without emotional threats. That truth does not destroy solid relationships. It only reveals those that were already fragile. When you begin to listen to anxiety as a request for truth, something changes. Fear loses strength. Confusion starts to organize itself. You begin to understand that anxiety is not trying to pull you away from love, but to guide you toward relationships that do not require self-abandonment. Ignoring this request prolongs suffering. Answering it requires courage, but it gives back something essential: respect for yourself. After everything that has been said, there is an inevitable question that must be asked honestly. What should a love that does not generate anxiety feel like? The answer is not found in romantic idealizations or perfect relationships, but in something much simpler and deeper: emotional safety. A calming love is not one without conflict, but one that does not threaten your identity. It is a love where you do not need to constantly explain yourself or justify your feelings. A love where you are not afraid of making mistakes, speaking too much, or being who you are. A love that does not keep you in a constant state of alert. Rebuilding the relationship with yourself is the first step toward recognizing this kind of love. When you spend too much time in anxiety-producing bonds, your emotional reference becomes distorted. You start believing tension is normal, peace is boring, and intensity must hurt. And this keeps you away from healthier relationships. The reconnection process begins when you learn to listen to your internal signals without blaming yourself for them. When you understand that anxiety is not a flaw, but a response to environments that do not respect you. When you start asking yourself, does this bring me closer to myself or further away? The love that calms allows silence without fear. Distance without abandonment. Dialogue without emotional punishment. It does not require you to shrink to fit. It does not demand constant availability. It does not require you to live according to someone else's mood. But to recognize this love, you must first become a safe place for yourself. You must respect your boundaries. Honor your feelings. Trust your perceptions. Stop trading your peace for emotional crumbs. Anxiety decreases when you stop betraying yourself. When you choose bonds that do not require self-abandonment. When you understand that being alone for a while is less painful than staying in a relationship where you never truly relax. True love does not race the heart with fear. It slows it down with trust. It does not create constant confusion. It brings clarity. It does not make you doubt your worth. It reminds you of who you are. If you feel anxiety around someone who says they love you, be careful. Not to run immediately, but to look with courage. Because love that is worth it begins the moment you stop ignoring yourself.